Now, while being a massive shill for larger Japanese game studios has practically become a full-time job for me, I've made it known a couple times how much I love the indie developer Supergiant Games. From Bastion to Transistor to Pyre, every game they've put out in their last 8 years as a studio is something I've genuinely adored, with Transistor being on my shortlist for favorite games of all time. Despite having a smaller dev team even for an indie studio, each of their games have had innovative gameplay, interesting narratives, and beautiful aesthetics, arguably acting as the gold standard for what an indie studio can accomplish. So when it was announced during the 2018 Game Awards that Supergiant was developing Hades, an isometric roguelite based on Greek mythology and including many of the Olympian gods in its cast, you could say I was interested. Meaning, if you're expecting a perfectly unbiased perspective in this video, you might be a tad disappointed. However, when I found out that Hades was going to be out on paid early access on Epic Games' new store during the announcement, I was slightly apprehensive. You do get the game at a discounted rate compared to when it's officially released, but selling something that isn't finished with no clear date on when it will be doesn't exactly get many players rushing to grab their credit card information. And that isn't even mentioning that this is also an odd move on the part of Supergiant, as they've never really dabbled in early access for one of their games before, and are big enough at this point not to really require it like some smaller studios. Something the devs even address in the FAQ on their website. However, in spite of my hesitance, I was still extremely interested in seeing what Supergiant had created this time around, and how this new approach to development was going to affect it. So with all that in mind, how well does Hades work, both in terms of being an early access game currently on sale, and as part of Supergiant Games' ongoing legacy? To start off, you play as the minor Greek god Zagreus, who's trying to escape the underworld labyrinth Hades after getting tired of living with his disdainful father, Hades, with many other gods and heroes choosing to help you in your repeat breakout attempts, as with every death, you're sent back home to try again. Now, for you Greek mythology nerds that might be wondering how authentic the game keeps to the classic stories, there is parts of the mythology being omitted and changed around here, especially with the various versions of Zagreus, though those details appear to be involved with some of the reveals in the story so far, namely with Zagreus' mother, and is likely going to be expanded on later on as more updates come out, possibly even playing around with the different tellings of the character's origin considering how certain gods act towards him. In fact, it's quite clever that Supergiant chose a lesser known rustic god like Zagreus as a way to explore the mythology, as opposed to using, say, Apollo or a Greek hero like Heracles, because then they have more freedom to play around with the mythology while still incorporating the larger Greek canon. Despite taking some liberties in the way the gods and stories are usually presented, it's clear the devs have a lot of love for Greek mythology. Gen Z's fantastic art style works super well with giving the gods and heroes unique designs while keeping to the core of how they're classically represented, like the god of the sea Poseidon having this aging surfer dude aesthetic to him, or Athena posing with a shield and owl, symbols often associated with her as the god of wisdom and strategy, with her brother Ares being the only one I wasn't able to recognize immediately until I noticed his helmet. Then there are little characterization changes for the sake of making a fun adaptation, like changing Cerberus, or Kerberos or Kerberos, depending on your particular pronunciation of it, from the Hound of the Underworld there to destroy any soul attempting to leave, into the family pet that tears up the house when Zagreus is away for too long and gets lonely.
You keep an eye on Father for me, boy. Don't let him sour up everyone's mood.
Cerberus promises to do exactly that, in his own way.
Classic Greek architecture and masonry is even incorporated into the level design, with the use of pottery for hidden gold, Greek bathhouse areas for healing, and ornate pillars which actually play into the combat, where hitting the columns causes debris to fall, damaging anything underneath. fitting with the tone that Hades is this ancient, decrepit place that's been around for centuries and is gradually falling apart. When looking at it, escaping from Hades, both the place and the god himself, makes for a good framing device for a roguelike game. The underworld is designed for no one to be able to leave, with the god of the dead there to make certain of it, so there would be plenty of countermeasures in place to stop you from getting to the surface, from general traps to Hades sending waves of creatures at you. Right from the start, you're tossed in with your sword, with more weapons unlocking as you progress, and have to attempt to get as far as you can get through Tartarus, with each room being randomly generated from a set of them full of enemies to fight off, eventually leading to fixed boss fights that are designed to be hard progression stoppers until you get good enough to finally get past them after multiple attempts. However, this is simply the basic framework of the game that everything else is built off of. Hades shines most in the sheer amount of options it gives you as a way to make every go through the underworld feel unique, as well as make it feel like when you die and have to start over, it's because you made a bad decision somewhere. The moment-to-moment gameplay feels like it's a balance between Bastion's straightforward combat style with Transistor's constant need for on-the-move strategy, finding ways to put varying effects and buffs together to best get through enemies. The first decision you have to make before each attempt to get through Hades is the weapon you equip, with all of them having unique main and special attacks to them, as well as a limited long-range cast attack that is the same across all weapons. However, similar to Supergiant's other games, as a way to incentivize you to experiment and not constantly use one in particular, you do get a bonus for picking different weapons between runs that give you more currency as a result, which you can then funnel back into upgrading your stats, whether that's how many dashes you have, the damage backstabs do, or the life you get back between rooms. But while each of the weapons has their own strengths and weaknesses that have to be accounted for, the bigger element that changes how you play is the way the gods of Olympus choose to help their nephew and or cousin escape from the underworld. Along with your basic weapons, you can find boons left by the gods themselves after encounters, which give you a selection of benefits to pick from related to their godly powers that you can then use to improve your particular playstyle. So with Zeus, many of his boon effects result in lightning effects following a particular attack, where Ares gives them a delayed extra hit, or Athena giving your skills the ability to deflect projectiles. On top of giving your attacks extra powers, these benefits also have a rarity system to them, which further boosts their effects depending on their rank, which can even be further powered up through eating pomegranates that you can find, fitting the Greek underworld motif. So as you continue further and further into a run and apply more boons to Zagreus, the more options you get as a result, with the later part of runs having upwards of 10 or more powers piled up on top of each other. Though, while they seem all too ready to help you, the game still does get across how petty the Greek gods could be as well, as there are rooms that have you choose between two of them, only for the unchosen one to be miffed you didn't pick them, and then proceeds to send a couple waves of enemies at you that they've bestowed their own effects on. But if you make it through the trial, you get a boon from them as well, meaning it's highly worth it to pick doors that have this situation behind it. Which is another interesting gameplay element for a roguelite. While the rooms are randomly assorted throughout the game, the doors between them have symbols to indicate what rewards you'll get for surviving through the next horde, allowing you to make better decisions on what would be good for you at that moment, rather than everything being purely random and just hoping for the best. Don't have a lot of cash? Then choose the door with a boon behind it as opposed to the one that leads to Karen's shop. Low on health? Pick the one that has the centaur heart on it that'll give you a health boost. Despite being a roguelite designed around you adapting to the random encounters you face, Hades is also built around you being able to make choices as to how best you want to deal with that randomness, which is how each run-through is kept fresh and different while still feeling like you have some decision on how it's going to play. A minor problem with this system though is that in combination with the weapons, boons, and some enemies, at times it can be too beneficial to play it lame and simply spam the same attack repeatedly. Also, the fact that you can choose what effects the boons gives you means that one of your attacks can consistently get overpowered by the latter part of runs as you put more into it, which can result in you cheesing out the game by abusing that specific skill. I don't think this ruins the game in any way, since every run is going to have different upgrades and weapons to use, and part of the fun is figuring out what combinations work best, but it does make your other attack options less appealing to use once you decide which one you're going to invest in. One major way Hades attempts to prevent this play it lame strategy though is the large variety of enemies with different attacks and powers, as there really isn't a coverall strategy that is perfect for handling all of them, especially in the later game where stronger armored enemies appear that can't be as easily stun-locked or kept away from. Some have strong range attacks, some drop from above so you need to be constantly on the move, some try to turn you to stone so you can't be close to them for too long. And that isn't even accounting for the boss enemies that, on top of having groups of add-on grunts and environmental traps to keep you on your toes, have a bunch of varying attacks to use depending on how you're playing against them. So you have to be ready for anything that might come up. Though, since the game is designed around constantly trying and retrying to get into further chambers, Hades actually takes advantage of the downtime it gives you between those runs. After dying, but before running off to die again, you are brought back to the House of Hades, and this is where a lot of the story and character is conveyed, with Zagreus casually chatting with the gods and spirits there about what's going on around the house, responding directly to how far you've been able to get, and gradually expanding the cast there as the game progresses, really painting a picture of how Hades works as both a household and the resting place of the dead. Or you can just check on Cerberus and then leave the rest alone. During runs, you can additionally find Ambrosia, the nectar of the gods, which you can then gift to characters you like in exchange for keepsakes, pieces of equipment that give you added benefits that are reflective of their character, which themselves can be ranked up from repeated use to increase their effect. Though you're only allowed to equip one at a time, so picking which one to use depends largely on what you find most useful to how you typically play the game. Lastly, I would be remiss not to give mention to Darren Korb's music, which has always been a major strength of all of Supergiant Games' releases, and that still holds true with Hades, fitting the tone and setting of the game by incorporating various Mediterranean instruments like the baglama, latva, and bouzouki, with a progressive rock sound and a touch of Halloween music that all fits with both the eerie Greek underworld aesthetic and fast pacing of the gameplay. Now, I wish I could take credit for that musical analysis, but a lot of that actually comes from Korb himself, as I'm not as musically inclined as I wish I could be. So who better to ask how it was incorporated than the person who created it? So if Hades appears to be in a pretty much completed state concept-wise, from the gameplay, visual design, and music, you might be asking, why does this game even need to be in early access then? Why not keep it in private development until it was ready to be released finished, and save the time of having to constantly maintain a public build? Well, going by the FAQ for Hades, while Supergiant has had previous games' playable builds at events for fans to try before, they thought that building off the ongoing feedback of players with an early access build would be much better in the long term for this project. And with something such as a roguelite like Hades, where there are near infinite ways that the game's mechanics can be put together, and thus a near infinite amount of issues or exploits that can come up, having the community be involved in the ongoing development is a smart way to make sure the completed version is as well put together and realized as possible. I mean, it worked amazingly for Dead Cells as far as I can tell. With Hades, aside from a couple stuck animations and the occasional frame drop, Supergiant have been really great at not putting out anything buggy or half-baked, at least in my experience, only releasing larger updates after they'd gone through their own internal QA, and is mostly using player feedback as a way to fine-tune what they're already doing. The devs are constantly making tweaks to the way boons and weapon abilities work, nerfing elements that are being abused to burn through the game, buffing those that are being largely ignored, and fixing what might be causing glitches when they come up based on player data and responses that they're getting on their Discord, which all the developers of the studio are on. The feedback channel even has a system built in to show which posts are most popular among the players, so as to better gauge what they would be most happy to see integrated into the game, acting as a sort of democratic forum. At the end of the day, the developers are going to be the ones to dictate what gets implemented and what doesn't based on how it works with their intended design. But I think it's rather innovative to have the players so directly involved in the way the game's being developed, as they're going to have a drastically different perspective on how the game plays and feels compared to the devs creating it.
That's as far as I can get for now.
Early access.
Yes!
We got you, fam. It's like fucking Transistor. Yeah. Man.
Nice! Thank you so much.
You're welcome, bro. There's more. Talk to Hades.
Go talk to Hades, dude. Come on.
Now, betting on early access is always going to be a gamble. It can be hard to sell someone on an unfinished product, as there's a lengthy history of games being stuck in early access for years with no real sign of when it'll be finished, or the creators themselves disappearing before that. And many players don't want to play something piecemealed out to them over the course of months, even if it's being updated regularly, and would rather binge the entire thing once it's in a finished state. Plus, on the developer side, the game successfully being in early access means that there's a little rest time for the devs, as they need to be constantly working on it and responding to all the bugs and glitches that may come up on top of adding in additional content, which I can only imagine is a lot more exhausting than if the development was purely behind closed doors. If you watch the NoClip documentary on Hades, you can see how much stress the team is going through trying to make sure their early access build is playable and doesn't have any major issues going up, since that first experience is going to color how a lot of players are going to judge it going forward, whether they play it themselves or see an early access review about it. However, I think Supergiant has struck a great balance using early access to complete work on Hades. The game is getting frequent patch updates based on feedback from players to fix, nerf, and buff boons, enemies, and other elements, with notes included for every change and icons to denote which were inspired by input from the community. Major updates for the game are also currently coming out about once a month that include more characters, interactions, enemies, and mechanics, giving even more reason to continually go back and replay it. Originally, I was apprehensive seeing Supergiant release one of their games into paid early access and what that could mean for them. But after putting the time I did into Hades and seeing how they've utilized it as part of the development, I'm much more optimistic about how this will shape their final product, and really look forward to seeing what future updates will bring to the game, as this has the potential to be some of Supergiant's best work yet.